It was supposed to be an ordinary day, a routine dig in a desert area of southern Turkey, where researchers were searching for traces of ancient Jewish communities. The team, made up of archaeologists and technicians from the University of Haifa, had been there for weeks, braving the heat, the dust, and the slow progress. No one expected to find anything more than pottery fragments and perhaps a tomb or two, as they had in previous seasons. But that morning, just before 8 o'clock, as the first beam of light illuminated a partially unearthed rock wall, one of the interns, a young woman named Dahlia, called for help. She had found something, and that something was unlike anything the others had seen before. At first they thought it was a burial chamber, but when they removed the entrance slab, they found a dry tunnel, dug in a strangely precise way, spiraling down for dozens of meters, with symmetrical markings on the sides. There was no sign of bones or inscriptions on the walls, just silence, and the air getting colder with each step. One of the workers commented that he felt pressure on the back of his neck, as if someone were watching him. Another complained of a buzzing sound that wouldn't stop, even with his ears covered. They continued on, though their curiosity was greater than their discomfort. But it took them only 15 minutes to realize that this place did not follow any logic known to traditional archaeology. When they reached the end of the descent, they found a door carved directly into the rock, with no visible hinges or gaps. It was heavy, with reliefs that no one could immediately identify. They looked like ancient symbols, but they did not belong to any known language. Professor Aziz, the person in charge of the expedition, asked them to take pictures of everything before trying to open it. But one of the cameras simply jammed. The other only recorded a dark spot, as if the lens were obstructed, even though it was clean. One of the local engineers, impatient, touched the center of the door with the palm of his hand. At that moment, the rock gave way with a sharp crack and slid aside, revealing a narrow corridor illuminated by a faint amber light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. No one said anything. It was as if the voice had been sucked out of it. Only later, when reviewing the audio recordings, did they realize that that part of the recording was completely silent, with no static, no ambient noisy. Nothing. The next chamber was larger, with a vaulted ceiling and completely smooth but unnatural walls. There were tool marks, as if everything had been carved by hand, except the lines were millimeter straight. In the center was a stone structure that looked like an altar, with steps on the sides and a circular recess, as if something was supposed to be placed there. One of the researchers, Yoram, approached to examine it, but when he touched the top of the structure, he immediately recoiled. He said he felt a cold burning sensation on his fingertips, as if he had touched frozen metal, even though the stone was at room temperature. The others laughed, but no one else volunteered to touch it. That was when they noticed something bizarre. The analog clocks had all stopped at the same minute. The digital ones blinked, and their cell phones restarted for no apparent reason. It was as if time, inside, was working differently. Aziz, now visibly uneasy, suggested going back and waiting for backup from the university. But before they could climb up, they heard a low guttural sound coming from inside the stone. No one would admit that they were afraid, but the tension was palpable. The sound, low, almost like a muffled growl, didn't seem to have a clear source. It reverberated through the space in a strange way, as if it were coming from all sides at once. Yoram stepped away from the altar, eyes wide, and tripped on one of the steps, knocking some of the equipment to the floor. The impact activated one of the emergency flashlights, which projected the light directly onto the ceiling. And that's when everyone saw it. Hidden high in the vault was a narrow opening, like a crack, from which hung what looked like dried fibers similar to tendons or roots, but artificially organized. No one could explain why it caused so much discomfort. It was just a crack and some filaments, but the simple fact that they were there, at that height, as if they were the remains of something that had lived, froze everyone for a few seconds. The engineer who had opened the door earlier turned to leave, pale, without saying anything. He was sweating coldly, and his eyes avoided his colleague's gaze. As he tried to return through the corridor, he took only 3 steps before falling to his knees, as if struck by something invisible. He began to vomit violently, his body shaking as if in a fever. The others rushed to help him, but as they approached, they heard him muttering one word, repeatedly under his breath. The audio recording did not capture it clearly, but to some it sounded like he was saying, "He's not dead." Professor Aziz ordered an immediate retreat, and they carried the man by the arms back to the entrance level. The climb was slow, tense, and heavy. When they finally emerged to the surface, the engineer was already unconscious. It took more than 40 minutes for the base ambulance to arrive. During that time, he did not wake up, but his body continued to shake. Intermittently, none of those present wanted to go back down that day. Later, when questioned by a university team about what had happened, no one could accurately describe the events. It was as if they were remembering something they had seen in a dream, and the more they tried to remember, the more distorted it seemed. The next day, only 4 members of the team agreed to go down again with a thermal camera, new measuring instruments, and 2 armed security guards sent by the university. The camera was intact, but something had changed. The altar in the center of the room now had superficial marks around its central cavity like scratches, or grooves made by fingernails or claws. None of the people present admitted to having touched it before. Even stranger was the thermal reading. Despite the normal room temperature, the space above the altar, all the way to the ceiling, formed a vertical column of low temperature, like a kind of invisible cold corridor at -6 degrees. The phenomenon completely defied logic. There was no draft, no light, no physical explanation for it. One of the technicians suggested that it might be a sensor failure, but all the other devices showed the same thing. There, right in the center of the room, the air was as cold as a freezer, and it remained that way, static, without dissipating. This time, no one dared approach the altar. They took photographs, took measurements, and left in less than 30 minutes. At the camp, Professor Aziz informed the university that the excavation would be suspended until further analysis, and the data would be sent to an international committee. That night, 3 members of the team reported vivid dreams, with scenes they described as visions of a dark place, full of whispering voices and motionless human figures, arranged in rows, as if waiting for something. The most striking detail was the constant sound of chains, as if everything in that place was tied down, but alive. One of the technicians refused to continue with the project the next day and bought a ticket back to Israel on his own. The engineer, still hospitalized, had not woken up, but clinical exams showed intense brain activity, almost as if he were in a state of continuous dreaming. The doctors said they had never seen anything like it. No substances had been detected in his system, no injuries, no explanation. 2 days later, a team from Jerusalem arrived at the site. They were not just archaeology experts. They also included a consultant from a Bible study institute and a representative from the Israeli military. The site was temporarily closed and access restricted. No information was released to the press. Aziz and 2 colleagues were called to a closed meeting and returned with clear orders. No one was to enter the underground structure until further authorization. But even with access suspended, things did not return to normal. One of the night watchmen reported hearing metallic sounds coming from the entrance to the excavation, like chains being dragged through the earth. Another worker reported seeing a figure standing at the edge of the excavation at around 3 a.m. in the distance, motionless, looking down. When he approached with his flashlight, no one was there. These reports were recorded but dismissed as stress and imagination. Even so, the number of people willing to stay in the camp dropped by half that week. The following week, images from the thermal camera were sent to a European spectral analysis team. The results returned with an unusual observation. There was a constant energy frequency emitted in the underground chamber, something between the patterns of an electromagnetic field and low-intensity radiation, but with no identifiable source. Interestingly, when they compared the data with the measurements taken during the first descent, they noticed that the frequency seemed to pulse in a rhythm that repeated itself every 72 hours, as if something there, followed a cycle or was being activated by it. Mentioning this data provoked an unexpected reaction from Professor Aziz. He remained silent for a few seconds, then took a blank sheet of paper and wrote just one sentence: 3 days. One of his assistants asked him what he meant by that, but he did not answer. He got up, gathered his belongings, and requested immediate termination from the project. He never spoke about the matter to anyone again. After Aziz's departure, the project was taken over by a British researcher named Michael Caine, known for his skepticism and technical rigor. It was he who decided to send the reliefs of the original door and the markings around the altar for symbolic analysis at universities in Germany and Greece. The answers were slow, but they were disturbing. None of the symbols corresponded to known languages, ancient or modern. However, one of the scholars from the Institute of Orthodox Theology pointed out similarities between the pattern of grooves around the stone structure and an apocryphal illustration found in a 4th century Armenian manuscript, which described the Descensus Christi in Pharaoh's The Descent of Christ into the World of the Dead. This association, initially dismissed as coincidence, began to bother those involved. The manuscript in question mentioned a door without a lock, guarding a room of silence where time does not flow, which led some to suspect that the find might be more than just archaeological. Cain, still skeptical, avoided any religious connection, but in his personal diary, recorded later by his assistant, he wrote, "If this is so, we are not ready." A few days after this discovery, one of the students involved in the first descent was found in his dorm in a dazed state, mumbling incoherent words. When taken to the hospital, he mentioned, in jumbled sentences, that he had seen faces inside the rock and that they were still waiting. The medical team classified the episode as acute reactive psychosis, but the young man had no history of mental disorders. He was removed from the project, but before leaving, he gave the team a notebook with notes he had been keeping since the incident. In it were repetitive drawings of the same symbol, a circle with 3 vertical marks cutting through it from top to bottom. The same symbol, it was later discovered, appeared in an almost identical form at the base of the altar, but it was only visible when using ultraviolet light. The strangest thing was that when trying to photograph the symbol under this light, all the images came out corrupted as if something was interfering with the camera's sensors at that very point. As the analysis progressed, a difficult decision had to be made to seal off access to the tunnel again. But the attempt to isolate the structure did not go as planned. On the night the sealing work began, a blackout hit the entire base. Generators failed at the same time, and motion sensors in the external areas went off for over an hour, recording movements around the excavation. The security cameras captured only dark images, with brief flashes of interference and a sequence of frames where a figure appeared and disappeared in the lower corner of the screen. The technician in charge tried to restore the video, but said that the data was empty, with no archive weight. It was as if the video had been erased, but was still visible. After this event, 2 workers requested immediate dismissal. They claimed to hear the sound of chains every night, even miles away from the site. One of them cried as he spoke, saying that there was something down there that hadn't been called yet. This type of phrase began to be repeated among the other team members in the following days, always said by people who did not communicate with each other. The project was officially suspended and classified as under structural risk analysis, but the final report was never released publicly. Years later, in 2019, one of the technical assistants involved in the excavation, now retired, was found dead in his home in Haifa. The official cause was cardiac arrest. However, what caught people's attention was what they found in the basement of the house. Walls covered with reproductions of the circular symbol with 3 vertical marks, repeated dozens of times, as if you were trying to commit it to memory. There was also a rudimentary map with coordinates very close to the location of the excavation, and disjointed notes that mentioned inverted days, placed between worlds, and the word Sheol, written in large letters, repeated 5 times. The family claimed not to know that he was still researching the subject. According to his wife, he never spoke about that period again. He would only say, from time to time, that the place was not empty. After the technical assistant's death, a Loki story appeared in a local Haifa newspaper mentioning his involvement in a controversial dig years earlier. This caught the attention of an independent investigative journalist, who began tracking down the names of the team involved in the original project. It was then that he discovered that 3 other members had also died in the past 5 years, all of whom were considered natural causes, but who shared similar patterns: isolation, sleep disorders, and obsessive behavior related to documenting what they had seen. One of the victims was Dahlia, the intern who had first identified the entrance. Her brother said in an anonymous interview that she spent the last years of her life waking up at 3:33 a.m. every day, jotting down disjointed sentences in notebooks, many of them in ancient Hebrew, a language she did not speak. One recurring passage read, "He came down for us, but not all of us came up with him." The family tried psychological treatment, but the symptoms never abated. The official cause of death was respiratory failure during sleep, but her medical history was otherwise perfect. Michael Caine, the British archaeologist who had taken over as director after Aziz, has disappeared from public record. His last scientific publication was the month after the project was suspended. After that, there were no articles, no interviews, no appearances at conferences. A former colleague revealed that he had moved to a monastery somewhere in Sicily and had abandoned academic life altogether. When they tried to track him down by mail, they received a handwritten reply: "Don't continue. Some doors are made never to be opened. The key is no longer with us." The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched Caine's previous records. Since then, the entrance to the excavation has been officially sealed with reinforced concrete, and the area has been declared unfit for any activity. But in closed forums of archaeologists and theologians, a rumor still circulates that the original records of the excavation were not destroyed, but simply hidden, and that some of the documentation is in the custody of a religious institution in Jerusalem. In 2022, a former member of the technical team, who wished to remain anonymously, shared on a private academic forum a series of documents that had allegedly been extracted from the University of Haifa's database before the project was shut down. Among the files were audio recordings that were never officially released. One of the clips, just over 30 seconds long, captured the sound of what sounded like rhythmic, heavy breathing coming from inside the underground structure picked up by a microphone, mistakenly left on in the chamber during the first visit. When analyzed by sound engineers, the audio showed oscillations that did not correspond to patterns of wind, vibration, or electromagnetic interference. It was as if something were actually there, breathing. But the strangest thing was that when the spectrogram of the recording was overlaid with the shape of the circular symbol discovered on the altar, the resulting shape was nearly identical. This led to speculation that the sound and the symbol were somehow connected, as if the symbol represented not just a mark, but a living frequency. The leak of these documents has sparked a new wave of interest in the case, but no official authority has commented. Curiously, a few days after the leak, the forum was taken offline without explanation, and the account of the user who posted the files was permanently deleted. Since then, everyone directly involved with the original project has remained silent. But there are scattered, unconfirmed reports that people in the region where the excavation took place continue to hear underground sounds at night. Some Bedouin shepherds, whose families have lived in the area for generations, refuse to go near that part of the desert. They say that something woke up when they opened the rock. None of them can explain what that something is, but they all repeat the same phrase, passed down from father to son: "He who went down did not return alone." And even without knowing exactly what it means, those who listen feel the weight of it, as if, deep down, they know that this story is not over. Recently, a Brazilian researcher who had been studying the case in silence since 2015 traveled to the region with the aim of finding the exact location of the excavation. He was not an archaeologist, but a theologian. He claimed that the descriptions of the underground chamber coincided with ancient rabbinical interpretations of the bosom of Abraham, and believed that it could be the only physical record of a spiritual reality mentioned in the scriptures. According to his account, he located the approximate area, but everything was completely covered by concrete slabs and surrounded by improvised barbed wire fences. Still, one night, he remained there for a few hours, sitting near the exact spot where the entrance would have been. Around 2 a.m., he claims to have heard a kind of whispering coming from the ground, not in Hebrew or Aramaic, but in a language he did not recognize. He tried to record it with his cell phone, but the device turned off by itself and did not work again that night. Upon returning to the hotel, his skin was cold, his speech slow, and he claimed to have felt something moving inside the earth. Today, almost no one outside the most restricted circles of archaeology and theology knows about the existence of this story. It has never been published in official media. The documents are scattered, stored, or suppressed, and those who know simply do not talk about it. But still, the feeling is that something has been opened, that for a brief moment, for some reason that no one can explain, a passage between distinct realities has manifested itself, one that should not have been there, or that had always been there. Whatever was in that chamber, be it just stone, frozen air, or something much older and more conscious. What is truly disturbing is the silence that came afterwards. the absolute silence. Because when something ends naturally, it dissipates. But when something simply stops out of nowhere, without explanation, the feeling that remains is that it is just waiting. And that is what bothers me the most to this day. The certainty that it was never finished, it just stopped. And no one knows for how long. A few years later, a new Earth mapping satellite passed over the original excavation site. Among the data it captured, a civilian technician identified a curious thermal anomaly, a circular zone 18 meters in diameter, slightly cooler than its surroundings, with a constant temperature at all hours of the day and night. There was no vegetation, no shade, and no underground water flow. When he cross-referenced this information with old records from the University of Haifa, he realized that the circle overlapped exactly with the spot where the tunnel had been discovered years earlier. He sent the report to the company, but the response was a request to archive the data as irrelevant. Even so, the technician saved a personal copy because he thought it was unusual. What he never knew and may never learn is that other identical anomalies had already been detected in 2 different places on the planet, one in the Jordanian desert, the other on a remote plain in Ethiopia. No one knows for sure what was really discovered there. There are no answers, no consensus, no definitive proof, only fragments of stories, distorted images, recurring dreams, and forced silences. It all began and ended in a single spot on Earth, in a single day, without any prior warning, and to this day, nothing like it has ever been found. But sometimes, when someone mentions the case in closed circles, there is no heated debate, there is no laughter, no denial, only an uncomfortable silence, because everyone who has gotten too close to that place carries something in common. The strange feeling that they have witnessed not just an excavation, but rather an intersection, a point where 2 worlds touched for an instant, and something happened. No one knows what, no one knows why, but it happened, and that, in itself, is more than anyone would like to admit.